evening, everyone. Welcome to our perspective series this evening. As always, we are grateful and would like to thank our partners who helped to make the speaker series possible. Most notably, the North Olympic Library System for their help with hosting the series over Zoom, and also the Friends of Olympic National Park and Discover Your Northwest, who help with the presentations, marketing, and also helping to acknowledge and thank our speakers. Tonight, we are fortunate to hear from Pat Crain, who is a fisheries biologist at Olympic National Park. Before I turn it over to Pat, I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. We typically do these on the second Tuesday, but we had to adjust our schedule, and it's gratifying to see that the word got out and so many of you were able to join us. Our next presentation will return on the second Tuesday of February, February 14th, when Christopher Tonra, who is an associate professor at the Ohio State University, who's done some research on the American dipper and its response to salmon, will be presenting for us. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Pat Crain. If you have questions, please use the chat feature. Go ahead and type that in there, and I will be able to, we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, thanks so much. And I'll turn it over to Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And thank you, Sarah. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. As Sarah mentioned, these presentations are usually on the week previous, but I had the opportunity to go on a wonderful ski trip up to Canada with some friends, and Sarah was graciously able to make the change. And I also want to thank everyone who's on this presentation. Thank you for accommodating the change as well. It's really wonderful to see the number of people that are here for the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my video now and try sharing my screen, and we can get started. So Dean, can you tell me if you're seeing the
I'm seeing your title slide in your presentation now.
Okay.
So it looks good.
Great, thank you. So, oops, I am so sorry. So Dean, I have a technical issue right from the beginning here. I'm seeing all of the admit folks into the room.
Yeah, that's gonna just show up on your screen.
Okay.
It's not showing up on the screen that everyone is looking at, so.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, sorry for the little delay there. As I was putting this presentation together, I realized that the ecology of Lake Ozette is just diverse and complicated and complex, and far more than I had thought when Dean approached me about doing this presentation. Not that I didn't know it was complex already, but I didn't really appreciate until I started digging into some of the work that's gone on at the lake over many years, just how complex it was. And so I'm only going to be able to touch a bit on the ecology of the lake, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to say anything at all about the Lake Ozette monster that you see in the background here, but it is there. I can verify it with this photo, and it's up to you to find it. So I have a confession to make from the beginning. I grew up in the Puget Sound area on Bainbridge Island. My family visited the Olympic Peninsula and Olympic National Park many times. We went to Nia Bay on occasion. We went to Clallam Bay. We went to Mora at the mouth of the Quileute River. But it wasn't until I started working for the Elwha tribe in late 1980s that I even heard about Lake Ozette. It is has been maybe a well-kept secret, at least for those of us in the Puget Sound area. And it's amazing to me because as I look at Lake Ozette in this aerial image, it looks so much like Bainbridge Island. How could I have grown up there and never known anything about it? Since then, with my work with Elwha tribe and then Clallam County and ultimately Olympic National Park, I've had the opportunity to do quite a bit of work at Lake Ozette. But as I said, as I was putting this together, I realized that I'm really a newbie. And unless someone spends all of their time and their career at Lake Ozette, there's really no way to fully understand it. But this evening, I'll try to give you an overview of the lake and some of the fascinating and somewhat disturbing things that we're finding out about the lake at this point. So we'll go through a bit of the setting, look at some of the environmental conditions, and then because I'm a fisheries biologist, I'm going to end talking about fish and salmon, and I'm sorry, you'll just have to put up with that. If you're on this, if you're watching this meeting, you probably already know where Lake Ozette is. But if you're not familiar with it, it is located on the Pacific coast, just a few miles from the ocean. It is very low elevation lake, and well, I'm sorry, I'll stop there. I do want to point out, though, that over here, if you can see my cursor, is Bainbridge Island, and you can see what I meant. Lake Ozette and Bainbridge Island seem to be cut with the same cookie cutter. So Lake Ozette is the third largest lake in Washington State. Nearly 7,600 acres, which makes it about a third of the size of Bainbridge Island. But the watershed area is 77 square miles, which is about 3 times the size of Bainbridge Island. And on Bainbridge Island today, there's about 25,000 people living there, and Bainbridge Island is about 25,000 acres. So that's about 1 person per acre on Bainbridge Island. And in the Ozette watershed, I would be surprised if there's 1 person per 760 acres. Very sparsely populated. Most of the upland use is dedicated to commercial timber harvest, and then around the lake, of course, is within the park. The lake itself is 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. Relatively shallow lake over its total depth of about 130 feet, but it is deep in some places, up to 330 feet deep, which means that the bottom of the lake is actually below sea level. The surface elevation, as I said, is very low elevation. It's about 35 feet. And being 5 miles from the ocean, that means that the Ozette River, which drains the lake, is extremely low gradient. The lake has one of the highest diversities of fish species within Olympic National Park, with 20 freshwater fish species. 16 of those are native fish and 5 are non-native. Non-native species include largemouth bass, like you see here, yellow perch, the American shad, which is a anadromous species, and then brown and yellow catfish, bullhead catfish. There's also 6 populations of Pacific salmon and trout, 1 endemic fish species, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. And the Lake Ozette sockeye population is listed under the Endangered Species Act, and just recently, West Coast steelhead have also been petitioned for listing, and West Coast steelhead also utilize the Lake Ozette watershed. So I said I'd get back to the endemic species. The Olympic mudminnow is unique to the Olympic Peninsula. It is a very small fish, about 1.5 inches long, but quite interesting. It's actually related to the great northern pike. And if you look at the fin structures, and if you imagine a great northern pike, you'll recognize these 2 prominent fins. And not only is it got those prominent fins, but its feeding behavior is also very similar. It's a rather than chasing its prey, it sits and waits and then pounces on its prey as it comes past. And it's just that its prey happens to be plankton, and northern pike eat ducks and frogs and that sort of thing, but a member of the pike family. And this fish uses the slough areas of the lake. So it doesn't spend much time in the lake itself, but it uses these slough features like Erickson's slough and Allen's slough down at the south end of the lake. You can also find Olympic mudminnow in off-channel areas of the Dickey and Quileute river systems, and other waters like these sloughs along the Olympic Peninsula. So I mentioned the Ozette River was extremely low gradient. Over its 5-mile length, it's got a gradient of less than 1%, much less than 1%. And when you have an average high tide level of 8 feet, you couple that with a big rainstorm, and the Ozette River actually backwaters. And sometimes you can see water during big storm event flowing into the lake out of Coal Creek, as opposed to going downstream. Also, because of that extremely low gradient, about the lower mile of the Ozette River are tidally influenced. And if you were to float down the river, snorkel the river, or go down in a boat, you would see saltwater species extending well up into the river channel. And the mouth itself is an exceptional place to visit. It's difficult to get to, but if you can get there, this is one of those places that reminds me a lot of Alaska, where the water, saltwater and the coniferous forest meet, and you can see how the water and the trees react with one another, and you get almost a knife edge on the bottom of the trees. The Ozette Basin itself was shaped by the Cordilleran ice sheet, which reached its maximum about 16,000 years ago. As you can see, the ice sheet covered what is now Lake Ozette. What's interesting to me about that from an ecological perspective is that Lake Ozette has a number of fish species that are native to the lake that are not anadromous. So they had to get in from a freshwater source. But as you can see, the lake was completely inundated by the ice sheet. So how did that happen? I'm guessing that that water from the Quileute River system at some point managed to get its way over into the Lake Ozette area and allow fish to move through that area. But I don't have a good answer for that. Landforms around the lake include the modern day prairies, which were formed by ice-walled lakes. You have glacial drift hills and glacial moraines as well. Because of the high rain levels on our west coast, exceeding 100 inches a year, the landscape in the watershed is extremely prone to erosion and landslide events. And we see this both in the tributaries to Lake Ozette and also out on the coast. If you want to know more about the landforms on the Olympic coast and in particular around Lake Ozette, there was recently a really wonderful paper put together by John Radel and all in 2021 called the Geomorphology of the Olympic, the Geomorphology of Coastal Olympic National Park. And I have access to that. I'm sure Dean can provide it as well. And it really does a great job at describing the geomorphology of the Olympic coast. So I stole a diagram from that paper just to show you a bit of what those landforms look like. Here you see Lake Ozette, quite deep. You have river deltas on the upslope side. Here's the drift mantled bedrock and moraine. Drift mantling means grooved, and then glacial deposits behind it. And then these ice-walled lake plains, which form the prairies. And then you've got some failures along the coast, and then the ocean here, sea stacks, etc. This deepness of the lake, John was not sure on what actually formed Lake Ozette. It's possible that it is a bedrock feature which is keeping the lake the way it is, but he didn't find any signs of kind of the fault lines that you would expect, or if that was the case. He also thought it was possible that the lake was formed by water seeping underneath the glaciers and scouring out the material underneath it, creating this giant scour hole. one other thing that I don't have time to talk about much in today's presentation, but some interesting new work that's going on through the USGS. They're using Lake Ozette as a record of historic earthquake activities on the Olympic coast. Because the lake is so pristine and because the sediment on the lake is so undisturbed, they're able to track movements of the silt material in the lake to look at the record of earthquakes in the area. So hopefully there's going to be some papers coming out from that work shortly. The prairies of the Ozette watershed are really a special feature. You don't see this sort of thing in many places in Washington. And if you've been there, you know that as you walk to the coast, you see these lovely grass and treeless areas. And it almost looks like they were maintained. And in fact, they were maintained for thousands of years by the macaw through fire. And with that fire, they were able to provide elk habitat that attracted elk into the area. And it also encouraged certain plant types to grow that were important to their community. So while these are natural features, they were also helped along over the ages. They also have a number of unique species in them, one of which is the macaw copper butterfly. This is a very rare butterfly that's unique to these prairies along the Olympic coast. When I put this presentation together, I wanted to say something about the cultural history, but the cultural history spans truly thousands of years. And so I thought that what I would do instead of trying to tell the full story would be to just tell a small piece. And that's, and I don't feel like the tribal piece is something for me to tell. So what I would encourage you to do is make a visit to the Macaw Cultural and Research Center out in Nia Bay. They have a fantastic museum, which is contains a number of artifacts from the Ozette village site. And they have the best story for you about the tribal history in the Ozette area. I feel a bit more comfortable telling you the story of the homestead families. The Ozette watershed was initially homesteaded in the late 1890s, and there were a number of families that came in the beginning when it was first opened up for homesteading. By the late 1890s, there were probably 130 homesteads around the lake. Assume a few people per homestead, and you very quickly have between 500 and 1,000 people living in the Ozette watershed in the late 1890s. At that time, there was no road to Lake Ozette, and so the only way you could get there was by trail from Clallam Bay or by taking a ship to the mouth of the Ozette River and then making your way up the Ozette River to the lake. The first road was completed in 1926, but power didn't show up until the mid-1960s. So the people who were living in the area around Lake Ozette learn to be self-reliant and reliant upon their neighbors. Things changed though with the coming of Olympic National Park. First, the Olympic Forest Reserve was established in 1897, and a number of homesteaders left soon after that. And when President Roosevelt authorized acquisition of the Lake Ozette area, there were very few homestead families remaining. The coastal area was incorporated into Olympic National Park in 1953. And then Lake Ozette itself and the western shores of the lake were added in 1976. And it wasn't until 1986 that the submerged lands and waters of the lake were added to the park. So what we have now at Lake Ozette is a watershed, which I said was upland use is dominated by commercial forests. There are a few people still living around the lake, either in permanent or in seasonal housing. There are a few people who live in the upland areas around the lake, but largely the lake and surrounding areas are now dedicated to recreation, either on the lake or hiking trails to the coast. So when you look at the lake and you're standing looking at the third largest lake in Washington state, it looks pristine. You look out over this area and you see the forests and the trees coming down to the lake, clean water, often see birds or seals and sea lions in the lake. And you would think that this was the last perfect place on Earth. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. And I'm going to talk a bit about the environmental conditions around the lake now. So if you were to walk down the Ozette River, you would find that there are areas of the river where the substrate is formed entirely by Western pearl shell mussels. You can't walk on them, the bottom of the channel, without stepping on the mussels. And those freshwater mussels are an indicator of water quality. When you have vast, healthy populations like that, the water has to be clean. There's also vibrant freshwater sponges that you'll see. They almost look like phosphorescent green, glowing. Again, those freshwater sponges are reliant on very clean water. And generally the water quality is excellent. But there are some problems. This top graphic here shows a number of streams that we're monitoring the park continuously for temperature. So on this side of the figure is the month of the year. And then each of these creeks are along the bottom. So we had Barnes Creek, Claylock Creek, Matheny Creek, Ozette, South Fork, Kalawa, Solduck, and Umbrella Creek. Umbrella Creek being a tributary to Lake Ozette. And what you see is that the Ozette River jumps out as being extremely warm. This temperature is approximating 70 degrees in August and into September. That is not a healthy condition for fish. It's not surprising though, because you have Lake Ozette feeding the Ozette River, and the lake itself, the surface waters can get warm simply through sunlight and air temperature. But it does hint that we're seeing air temperatures warmer than we have in the past. And then if you look at Umbrella Creek, which should be substantially colder, you see that Umbrella Creek is also quite warm when you compare it to, say, the Solduck or Barnes Creek. And this is also something that we're seeing in a number of creeks on the Olympic Peninsula, where the water temperatures in the summer are getting pretty warm. What goes along with those warm temperatures, both in Umbrella Creek and in Ozette River, is a low level of dissolved oxygen. So in this graphic down here, the orange dots are the Ozette River and the blue dots are Umbrella Creek. And this line here is the level at which you say that is a healthy system. Now, these are summertime dissolved oxygen levels, usually taken in late July or early August during the warmest temperatures of the year. So maybe it's not surprising that they're a little low in dissolved oxygen, but this is not seen everywhere on the peninsula. These warm temperatures and the low dissolved oxygen levels have led Umbrella Creek and other creeks in the area to be listed under what's called the 303D water quality impairment listing through the Department of Ecology. Another recent change at the lake has been the invasion of Asian clams. These clams were first introduced to the United States in the 1930s. It's thought that they were brought in on bilge water into the Columbia River, but they've now spread throughout the United States, both unintentionally and intentionally, as they were a food source for immigrants from Asia, and they brought them with them when they moved to the area. So they are an edible clam, but I would not eat them without knowing more about the water quality. At any rate, they first showed up in Lake Ozette in the Ozette River sometime in 2017. We first identified them in 2018. By 2018, I excavated 100 clams from a square foot of substrate in the Ozette River. So incredibly dense. They're very fast growing, and they have a lifespan of about 9 months, maybe a little bit over a year. So they're rapid growing, and they are hermaphroditic, so they are self-fertilizing, and they just spread like wildfire. We did a survey in 2021 in cooperation with David Cowles at Walla Walla University, and he identified Asian clams throughout the entire northern half of the lake, in many cases as dense as I had described for the Ozette River. And the issue with these clams is not quite the same as what you see, for example, with zebra or quagga mussels in some of the lakes elsewhere in the United States. They don't totally plug up water supply systems, but because they are so short-lived, there tends to be mass die-offs. And when you get those mass die-offs, you get a depletion of oxygen in the localized area, also a great increase in ammonia and other chemicals. So We're not quite sure what it's going to mean for Lake Ozette at this point, but it is something that we're watching very closely. And we would encourage all of you to spread the word. It's likely that these clams arrived at Lake Ozette via a boat. The work that Dr. Cowles did suggests that the populations first became established at either the campground boat launch or at the Rainier Landing boat launch. And since then, we have now found Asian clams just this summer at the Barnes Point boat launch in Lake Crescent. And so they are starting to populate the Olympic Peninsula where they hadn't been before. And this is of great concern. And while these Asian clams maybe aren't as bad as some of the worst aquatic invaders, it means that we don't have the controls in place to prevent them from getting into our lakes here on the peninsula. So another thing that happened to Lake Ozette was a change in the hydrology of the lake itself. And that came about through the removal in the 1950s of a huge number of log jams. This picture on the right is a 1950s photo of the Ozette River. And you can see that there was a full spanning jam here that water would get backed up behind during high flows. And you can see another jam here and another jam here. The river was simply loaded with jams. And this map here is showing locations where the Washington Department of Fisheries documented removal of jams, they thought to improve fish passage into the lake. It seems odd that now we do the opposite and put wood back into rivers. That change in the hydrology of the Ozette River led to a change in the shoreline of the lake. This is hard to see, so I'm going to use my cursor to draw it out. This is a 1964 photo of Olson Beach area, which is one of the prime spawning habitats for Ozette sockeye. And this is a 2003 photo. In 1964, this thin blue line here was the margin of vegetation along the beachfront, and everything in front of that was gravel cobble beach. By 2003, this green line was the edge of vegetation. And we believe that the reason for that was that when there was large amount of wood in the Ozette River, lake levels in the wintertime were higher and prevented vegetation from growing down onto the full beach. But now, with the removal of the wood from the river, winter lake levels tend to be not quite as high, but more importantly, the lake drains more swiftly now, so the areas don't stay inundated for as long. And so this encroachment of vegetation on the beaches has led to a loss of spawning habitat for sockeye salmon, which I will talk about a little bit later. We're also seeing a huge amount of sediment being delivered to the deltas of rivers in the lake. This is largely a legacy effect of past logging practices. New logging practices are much better. But as you can see here, this is a 1964 photo on the left and a 2003 photo on the right. And you can see the green line is the 2003 extent of shoreline. So the river delta has prograded out. almost 60 meters in some places, 180 feet lakeward. And then those materials then get transported down the shoreline. Another oddity that we've found in Lake Ozette is extremely high mercury levels in northern pike minnow and largemouth bass. To the extent that the park is now recommending that no one eat pike minnow or largemouth bass out of the lake, and that you limit your consumption of yellow perch and bullhead catfish from the lake. The mercury levels in bass were among the highest found in Washington State by the Department of Ecology when they did this work. And the reason for that is not entirely clear. The conditions around the lake actually set up nicely for mercury to be available in the water column, in that due to tannic acids in the streams, the pH is right for making mercury available. But where that mercury comes from is unclear. It may be from slash burning associated with logging, or it may be aerial transport from China with the coal burning plants in China being blown across the ocean and settling out here. We see similar things in the high mountain lakes in the park. But for whatever reason, it's accumulating in largemouth bass and pike minnow. We're also seeing elevated mercury levels in dragonfly larvae that are being collected in the lake. Dragonfly larvae are really great indicators for toxin, because they are long-lived as larvae and are in such close contact with the bottom, and they don't move much. And then, of course, they're predators, so they are also accumulating in themselves what the other animals down the food chain have eaten. So mercury is an issue. We don't have an action plan at this point, other than to continue monitoring and to have these advisories. So what about salmon? I said that I was a biologist, fisheries biologist, and I couldn't stay away from salmon. And so here I am fulfilling that promise. So as I said at the beginning, Lake Ozette historically supported 6 species of salmon. There was also a thriving village site along near the mouth of the Ozette River, which was undoubtedly there in part to take advantage of the sockeye returning to the lake and the other salmon that returned to the lake. But beginning around 1950, not only the sockeye populations, but all populations of salmon in Lake Ozette began a rapid decline. And just as a graphic, here is sockeye harvest in the Ozette River leading up to 1950. We don't have these years, unfortunately, but then collapsing immediately after the 1950 and continuing to decline until the last sockeye harvest along the Ozette River occurred in the mid-1970s. Also, chum salmon and Chinook salmon are now virtually extinct in the river. We occasionally see one or two, either adults or fry, out migrating, but what had once been a healthy population of both Chinook and chum salmon is now gone entirely. And because of this rapid decline, the Lake Ozette sockeye have been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. They're the only sockeye population in the state of Washington to be listed. And unique among salmon populations, they're the only population in Washington state that I'm aware of that is limited to a single watershed. So whereas Puget Sound Chinook are listed throughout the entirety of Puget Sound, Lake Ozette sockeye are unique enough that it was deemed that they deserved a listing for just the lake. Historically, the sockeye population was likely greater than 30,000 fish. By the early 2000s, returns of less than 1,000 fish were not uncommon. There was a program developed by the Makah tribe to supplement the sockeye population with hatchery production. I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. There are two streamside incubation facilities, one in Umbrella Creek and one in Big River. Between the hatchery supplementation and the natural run, the population is being preserved, but it's not recovering at this point. And more alarming is that the lake spawning component appears to be still in decline. Following the listing, there's been the development of a recovery plan for Ozette sockeye. Mike Haggerty and a number of other authors put together limiting factors analysis in 2009 that looked at just what factors might be keeping the fish from recovering. This is a very complicated graphic, but I'll just highlight the red arrows. If you see a large red arrow, that's an indicator of a factor that is likely having a major impact on recovery. And then within the circle are the life stages that those things are occurring. So here in marine rearing, we see general marine survival, which is unfortunately kind of a big black box that we can't do much about. But over here at adult spawning, we see that predation has a big red arrow, and that's at one point when the population was a little larger, there were quite a few seals that were making their way up into the lake and were eating fish as they staged to spawn. Also otter eat sockeye when they get the chance. There's another big red arrow over here with spawning habitat quality during the egg incubation to emergent time frame. I'm going to talk about this a bit. Then we have predation as a potential factor during lake rearing. That's largely cutthroat trout that were observed eating sockeye fry.
Pat, you asked me to let you know when there was when it was 7:50.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So what are we going to do? I've often felt a lot like my friend the ranger here, and that's me. There are staff at the Makah tribe that have been actively working hard at doing just exactly what needs to be done. And I'll talk about that here. First of all, there's been a number of projects undertaken, not only by the tribe, but by Clallam County timber companies, nonprofit organizations. The park has done a few, and others. For example, fisheries were closed entirely during the 1980s. And as I said earlier, the Makah tribe began the hatchery supplementation program in 1983. There's been multiple habitat restoration projects, including culvert replacements, large woody debris replacement, controlling of non-native vegetation, and road improvements. These images are not from Lake Ozette, but projects similar to this have been done in the Ozette watershed. And then we have liberal fishing regulations on the non-native species in the lake. So we are doing things. In addition, there is intensive monitoring going on in the watershed. Most of this is led by the Makah tribe. There is an adult enumeration system that counts fish coming into Lake Ozette. There's a smoke trapping operation that counts the number of fish leaving the lake each year. There's spawning ground surveys both on the lake and in the tributaries, counting the number of fish on the spawning grounds. And there's a water quality monitoring project. Would like to highlight this sonar system. Historically, the tribe counted fish coming into the lake manually with a weir, and they had a video camera that was focused on a passage through the weir, and they counted fish as they passed through. But there were problems with that. One is that predators were starting to learn how to use the weir as a way of fishing. And then also, it's a little more difficult to count the fish as they move through during the darkness. So that weir has now been replaced with a sonar system. And this is an example of an ARIS sonar system. And this is a very sophisticated sonar unit that produces near movie quality images from sound. And this is a copy of an ARIS sonar counting fish as they move past the camera. So not too different from an ultrasound machine. Also, the Park Service and NOAA Fisheries hosted, along with the Ozette, the Lake Ozette Steering Committee, focused a 3-day workshop or a 2-day workshop on the effects of predation on Lake Ozette sockeye in 2016. A number of experts were brought in to provide information on what predation can do to fish populations and what we might be able to do to limit those. We've also done things like taken that life history model that I showed earlier with the red arrows and made it into something that's a little more user-friendly that you can play with and look at how taking different actions at different life history stages might result in a change in the resulting population down the line. There's also been an extensive study done on otter around the lake. This was a multi-year project done through the Makah tribe and the University of Wyoming, Marab Ben David. And they were able to look over the course of a couple of years at what the otter were eating and get a guesstimate of how many otter there were and how they used the area. And one of the important things they found was that there doesn't appear to be an overabundance of otter. And they also found that otter are highly mobile. They are certainly using the Ozette River and Lake Ozette and the tributaries to Ozette, but that same otter will also go out to the coast and use food items along the coast and swim up and down the coast, even in the course of a single day. And due to the movement, they have a very variable diet. They don't just sit around waiting for salmon to swim by. They're eating opportunistically. Based on the work of that study, it was found that otter, at least, are not a significant source of mortality for adult sockeye. They found that maybe between 2 and 4% of the adult population could have been lost to otter predation, but that was based on observation of otter bones in their scap. And it's possible that the otter were eating fish that were already dead. They didn't have a way of knowing whether the fish were alive or dead when the otter was eating them. It also looks like otter were eating opportunistically out migrating smolts, but again, the predation rate was quite low. So it doesn't look like otter, at least, are a significant source of predation on sockeye at this point. And then the most recent thing in terms of the ESA listing is that NOAA just released their 5-year review. And what they said in that review was that habitat is a high risk. The quality of habitat is a high risk for sockeye recovery, and that we need to start taking additional actions to improve habitat. It looks like overutilization, in other words, overharvest of sockeye is not an issue, particularly because there's no fisheries in the lake itself, but more importantly, they pass through the nearshore fisheries, both in Canada and in the United States, before those fisheries really take off. Disease and predation remained high in their review, but this was largely because they had no information on predation. The recent results from the otter study may change their assessment in future reviews. They did point out that while regulatory mechanisms had been in place that kept the risk low, that's increasing in it. And what they called out was lack of enforcement with some of the regulatory actions in recent years. The hatchery risks they viewed were low. And this is really because of the way that that program is designed. The fish that are used in the hatchery are only reared for a short amount of time in the hatchery setting. They're then released into the tributaries at a very young age and allowed to rear naturally for over a year in the lake itself. And then lastly, they identified both climate change and drought as issues, and that's really highlighted in those temperature graphics that I showed you earlier. So suggestions that came out of the 5-year review were to improve beach spawning conditions through removal of encroaching vegetation, evaluate options for supplementation, essentially using hatchery fish to supplement beach spawning locations, try to get more fish to imprint on the beaches. They suggested that we try to develop a model that would be useful in evaluating impacts of wood placement in the Ozette River. It's recognized that wood placement in the Ozette River could affect those people that still have properties around the lake. And you can't do that without having some analysis and some evaluation of the impact. And at this point, we don't have a model that will do that. And further, what is the trigger that would determine whether placement of wood was the appropriate action? And we don't really have that developed at this point either. And then lastly, they suggested that we improve our ability to monitor adult abundance on the spawning grounds, and particularly on the beach spawning areas of Lake Ozette. So coming to an end here, this last summer, we tried to implement that first recommendation from NOAA and begin removing native vegetation that's been encroaching on spawning beaches of Lake Ozette. Just a series of photos here. This is on the left, what's showing up now is a photo from 2016 in the area that we treated. We started treating here and we ended here on the first day. This is that same location in 2009. And you can see how these areas are changing rapidly. And you can see the shoreline in here, which is vegetated here in 2013. And then this is the same location in I can't read the date right now, 1990s, I think, sometime. But anyway, you can see here that even more of the beach is exposed. And so what we were trying to do is, we knew this was an area that fish had spawned in the past, and we're trying to recreate these conditions that existed when fish were using that area. Similar to what is seen here, this is an area where sockeye are known to spawn. And you can see that this tree, this large spruce, is allowing wave action to scour out the area here and leave good spawning gravel, while this other vegetation has been encroaching around. We first tried this in 2018, and we tried just removing the surface vegetation, taking out the sweetgill here and cutting the sedge short, but we weren't able to remove the root structure. And what we found in monitoring the sites after we did the work was that dissolved oxygen levels in the gravels dropped to less than 1 milligrams per liter, which is not enough to support incubating eggs. We did see that the substrate coarsened a bit, which is what we were hoping for, but the root structure inhibited the improvements, and also we didn't have very much time to see the change. So in 2022, what we did was we took the time to actually remove the roots from the area that we had previously treated and then expanded that. And we did that without essentially any dedicated funding. With the help of the Makah tribe and student interns from Makah, we were able to recruit volunteers who contributed over 200 volunteer hours over just a 2-day period, and got in and removed the vegetation, and also removed the vegetation from the lake. We were able to treat about 200 feet of beach in that 2-day period. With 100 feet, we were able to remove all of the root structure with hand tools. And the remainder, we just cut the brush and the sedge to ground level. So this first year was really a pilot study, and we learned that we could do it by hand. And it was important to do it by hand because we're finding that the beaches at Lake Ozette contain cultural artifacts. And if we were to get in with heavy equipment, we would be disturbing that heritage. And further, getting heavy equipment out to these remote areas is very difficult. And we have a potential to impact the water quality as well. So doing it by hand was a good way of kind of easing into this project. And we found that we didn't disturb anything except for the surface. And we saw really no observable impacts to water quality while we were doing the project. But it was labor intensive. That's a really heavy bag of vegetation, taking 4 people to carry that to the boat and then transport that out of the lake. Disposal of the vegetation was really problematic. It's about a half-hour run from where we were working to the boat ramp. And then the vegetation got loaded in a truck and taken to the Cowan Ranch, where it was put into their mulch pile there, which was another 30-minute drive each way. So we were limited to really about 100 feet a day of treatment. Before we do this project again, we're going to think hard about where to do it. What's the most appropriate location to treat? We chose this location because we knew that sockeye were not spawning here now. So anything we did wouldn't affect the existing population in a negative way. It might attract fish in, but it wouldn't damage the existing population. We want to think about whether or not there's a better option for disposal of vegetation than taking it completely off site. Need to think a bit about the appropriate work group size. You can do more work with more people, but that means more boats and a lot of challenges in that regard. Maybe there's some other tools that we can use that will make us more efficient. And we are also continuing to want to study the effects of our work and make sure that it is producing the positive results that we had hoped for. Lastly, what's the sustainability of this work? Is it just a Band-Aid that's improving the habitat for a short amount of time and then vegetation begins to encroach upon it again? Or is this something that can be easily maintained over time? And I want to say thank you to all the people who participated in that project. Again, this project was really spearheaded by Joe Scordino and others at the Macaw Tribe. The student interns were invaluable, and the volunteers and Macaw staff and the National Park Service staff that participated as well. To do a project like that with no budget is really saying something about the commitment of the people involved.
Pat, I'm going to jump in here, and unfortunately, we're going to stop here.
I'm at my summary page. This is my last slide.
All right, Pat, go ahead. We're at 8:10 right now, so we're not going to have much time for questions.
Sorry, last slide is simply just to say that that Lake Ozette is in fact a treasure for Olympic National Park, but it is not pristine, and there are a number of things that we're facing at the lake, and challenges that we face both for restoring Ozette sockeye, but also for maintaining the health of the lake into the future. So when you see the lake, appreciate its beauty, but remember that there are hidden dark corners of the lake that we need to address. And I guess I always say Lake Ozette, but on the maps it's Ozette Lake. So there are many questions remaining about this lake. And that is it, Dean.
Okay, thanks so much, Pat, for your time and for putting that presentation together. It is a very complicated place with a long history, and lots of questions came in during your presentation. We just have a few minutes, so I'm going to try and lump them together from different people. and then also give you a little bit of time to answer. So we had several questions about the Asian clams, and those were about are the colonies, dense colonies of clams, are they reducing spawning habitat? Can the clam infestation be controlled? And are there organized efforts to engage the public in controlling the Asian clam population on the peninsula? So if you could briefly address sort of the Asian clam.
The Asian clams have not reached the sockeye spawning grounds yet, but we do have concerns that they will. And if they do, we already know dissolved oxygen is a big issue for spawning success on the beaches, and that's a huge concern. Unfortunately, there is virtually no mechanism to control these. You can spot control them by putting down mats that smother the bottom, but that only gets you an area as big as you smother, and then you still have to deal with the effects of the mortality of those clams. So control, once they're established, is very, very difficult. The real issue, and what I tried to emphasize, is that we need to prevent these from getting into other watersheds, and we need to prevent other aquatic nuisance species from getting into our lakes. And for that, yes, we are working on a public outreach. It's in its infancy right now, but one of the pieces that we have Walla Walla University under contract to do is to help the park develop a outreach program that will spread the message, and also potentially develop an inspection program to inspect watercraft in the park.
Okay, thanks, Pat. We had questions regarding the mercury and impacts to salmon survival. And then a question that came from an individual who wanted to know about fishing in Lake Crescent, and he worded it with fishing for safe and edible fish. So I'm assuming he probably is referring to the salmonid species.
Yeah, so two things. Because the particularly sockeye, but all of the salmonid species, with the exception of trout, resident trout, spend a large portion of their life at sea. The elevated mercury levels did not seem to be a problem either for rearing sockeye or for returning adult sockeye, or any of the salmonids. It seems to be more of an issue in bioaccumulation in those fish that remain resident in the lake for a long period of time. Eating perch is still considered by Washington Department of Health a healthy option for fish. And as long as you limit your consumption to about 3 meals a month. So eating perch is an option. I would not eat the bass or the pike minnow at this point. And we do have a non-retention requirement for trout in the lake. I honestly don't know what the mercury levels are for resident trout, but for instance, if they are a long-lived resident species like cutthroat, they may well have high mercury levels in them, just like the bass and pike minnow.
Well, I think that's going to wrap up our time here. I do want to thank everyone for your attendance today. Yes, Pat.
Dean, just real fast, I will answer everyone's questions that were submitted in chat. If people provided contact information, I would be happy to answer everyone's question via email after this.
Great. Thank you so much.
The library has previously hosted an answer sheet, so we can put that up on the event page for this in a week or two when Pat has had a chance to answer them all. So if you would like to see the answers to any of the questions asked by others, just look on the event page sometime next week.
Yeah,
All
happy to
right.
do that.
Thanks so much. And with that, I would just like to thank you all for your attendance this evening. And then remind you that our next presentation is on Tuesday, February 14th. What better way to spend Valentine's Day than on a Zoom with your sweetheart learning about the American Dipper. So please join us on Tuesday, February 14th. Thanks everyone so much for your attendance.
Thank you all.